welcome to DasGeek. I am so happy to be back. I am finally done with the stomach flu, I'm done with strep throat, and I'm done with the business trip that I was on that have caused me to not release any videos lately, but I'm back, and I have a fantastic video that I've been working on that I wanted to share, and it's the 10 myths that surround Linux. Now, where this list came from? Well, as you guys know, I'm newer to the Linux community. I don't have the advantage of having years and years and decades of experience using Linux as a lot of other Linux users. So the good thing is a lot of my audience, some of them are very experienced because they've certainly helped my channel grow and helped me learn things. But a lot of the folks are new to Linux or switched with me when I switched to Linux, which is amazing. And our subscribers continue to grow. So thank you so much for the continued support. But because of that, there are a lot of myths that I've seen in the comments and also on Twitter and other places that have come up when people are communicating about Linux, not trying to troll. They're asking genuine questions, the things that they heard. I think they've either used Linux in the past and it was back in what we call the dark ages where everything was done through the terminal, or they've talked to people who use Linux in the past and they kind of give them this idea of what Linux is. Well, this is kind of Linux now. You're staring at it and it doesn't look too mystifying. I think most people tend to think Linux is really difficult because of this thing right here. And I've got news for you. You don't have to touch this thing here. But let's get into that. So that's our first myth. Linux is difficult to learn. Linux is absolutely not difficult to learn at all. You will probably want to learn to play around with the terminal and want to learn all kinds of things about your operating system and your desktop environment, your file systems, and all of these things in the kernel and how it all interacts, because that's fun to learn, and that will help you be able to do more advanced things with Linux. But you don't have to touch this terminal. 9 times out of 10, almost probably 10 times out of 10, I don't think I've ever personally tried it completely, but I don't even think you could go through like a Linux Mint or another distribution. You would never even have to touch a terminal. And so from that aspect, when you go and you click Start on Windows, or you click the icon here or the icon for your distribution in Linux, you're kind of presented with a very similar, familiar thing here. You've got all of the programs you've installed, and they're categorized. So you've got Office, you've got your Internet, FileZilla, Firefox, you've got your settings, you want to change your appearance, your display. I mean, all of this is very, very familiar to anybody who's used any operating system out there. There are differences. There are differences in the terminology that's used is a big one, and believe me, there are a lot of people in the Linux community who will correct that terminology, but most of the people who do that will do it out of kindness and because they want you to learn. The ones who do it and troll, well, they just happen to be Linux users that are in the community. We don't like them, so don't worry about them. But most people are very, very open. One of the most beautiful, kind communities I've ever come across, especially on the internet, of people who are wanting to help you. So that is amazing. So Linux being difficult to learn is the first myth, and I think we can honestly say that's busted. There is nothing really difficult to learn about Linux. For instance, there's really nothing difficult to learn about Windows either, but there's a whole nother side to Windows that most people don't get into, such as the registry and different elements around there. And while professionals in IT and things would get into those elements, you wouldn't. And the same goes with Linux. There are absolutely super advanced things within Linux, and there are advanced distros that are made for that. But if you stick with Ubuntu or a Linux Mint or an MX or one of the major flavors of Linux out there, especially if it has like a KDE desktop or anything along those lines, super simple to use, absolutely can do 99.999% of everything within the GUI without ever having to touch a terminal. That very well may be 100%, by the way, but I've just never personally done it because the terminal intrigued me. It was that big scary thing everybody was afraid of, so I was like, well, I'm going to bust that because I want to learn it and not be scared of it, so I use the terminal a lot more. But you don't have to. You can see, you can navigate to everything you need right here. When you open something to configure, like your display, there's not some weird terminal that pops up that makes you type in code. You just kind of click on the monitor, set it to your settings, and move on. It could not be easier. And so it's very familiar, very easy to learn. The second myth I want to bust, and I think this channel has done a good job of busting this. I put Linux on some of the most powerful equipment I could afford. But when you look at the equipment that I have here, from the Intel i7-6700K, GeForce GTX 1080, NVMe M2 hard drives, 6 SSDs that are inside here, 144 hertz, high DPI monitor, DBX 286, Focusrite 2i2, Rode Procaster mics, Corsair K70, Zowie FK1 mouse. It goes on and on. Steam controller, Xbox controller here, whatever you want to connect, the hardware works within Linux. Now, are there times where some of this hardware may give you an issue? Sure. And some of that hardware is going to give you an issue at times within Windows as well. So that's something that people forget about. If they ever do have a hardware issue, they instantly will, in the Linux world, especially when they're new, say, oh, this must be a Linux issue. Whereas in Windows, they're not going to blame Windows, right? They're going to go and say, oh, this must be a hardware issue or something wrong with the driver, etc. So you need to apply the same principles that you would apply to troubleshooting a Windows machine that you would to Linux, and make sure you're looking through all of those things. But all of this hardware that I'm talking about here was compatible out of the box. I didn't have to do anything special. I didn't have to go into the terminal and run a bunch of special config files and write them myself and then compile them and turn them into scripts. None of that. It was plug and play. And because of that, I think that that myth is easily busted as well. Linux is not just for old machines. It runs brilliantly on new machines. And if you think about this statistic, 100%, used to be 99.9 or something, but now it's 100% of all supercomputers in the world, 100%, every single one of them runs Linux. So if you think about it from that aspect, the compatibility out there is incredible. There are certain pieces of hardware that you may have to finagle to get to work because that particular manufacturer decides they're not going to do anything for Linux, or it's not popular enough that the manufacturer has written a driver for Linux, or that the community has gone out there and written drivers for it. But 9 times out of 10, the community's already done the work for you, and you could just follow their steps. But did I have to do anything special with my NVIDIA card? I went and I installed the drivers. That's it. And then it works. I didn't have to do anything special with my Intel processor or my motherboard or any of those things to get them to work. Where that starts to fall apart, that story, a little bit, and where I think people get confused is, for instance, let's say you have a Razer keyboard, and that Razer keyboard or mouse will work perfectly with Linux. Now, in some cases, Razer may not be a good example because Linux community's actually written a program that does this, but in some cases, my point is, the hardware, the software that comes with your hardware to do little things like change the LEDs on your mouse or something like that may not have a Linux driver for it. So you're going to have to go out there and see if the community's done something, or see if there's some work there to do some configs to fix that stuff. But as far as the hardware itself, typing, moving your mouse around, you're not going to have any issue with that. And certainly some of the hardware you pick, just like if you were choosing to go make a Hackintosh or go build a certain computer for a certain purpose, you're going to put specific hardware in it. You could do that with Linux. So for the most part, you're going to be amazed how compatible Linux is with nearly everything out there, especially considering the fact that the manufacturers focus on Windows and not Linux. But that's not a market share issue per se. It's a market share issue when it comes to desktop components. But I think it's very important to note that Linux as a whole has a gigantic market share. The market share isn't in the desktop environment. It's not some little niche product that a bunch of geeks, got together in a conference and they use, and it's not a big deal. We're talking everyone from telecom, government, military networks, PlayStation, Google, Panasonic, Amazon. All of these folks utilize Linux in their enterprise structures. So you're not talking about something that's minuscule or small. Now, when you get into the user desktop environment, that's where you start having some of the, myths that have occurred around Linux over the years, because obviously from a desktop environment standpoint by itself, Linux does not have as big of a share as Windows does. But I think that's changing little by little. I think it's going to continue to change with Linux market share growing, and with the advancements that Linux has made in the desktop environment in the last couple of years. I think Windows is definitely in a run for its money. So 2 myths that we've busted so far. Linux is difficult to learn. It is absolutely not. It is as difficult to learn as you want it to be. It is as familiar as any Windows environment, especially depending on the distro you choose, Ubuntu, Linux Mint, something like that. You're going to get right into it. You're going to be able to figure out in a few seconds if you have a few brain cells. It's not hard at all. And then, of course, hardware-wise, Linux is very, very compatible with the latest and greatest hardware, and it does do fantastic for older machines. But I want you to focus on the fact that it can run on the latest and greatest stuff. The other myth I've heard is there are no major vendors that sell Linux-based computers, and that's kind of a way of, in some cases, people saying Linux doesn't matter out there because no major vendors sell it on their hardware. And that's absolutely false. Again, Dell has Linux-based systems that you can buy for consumers, not just for enterprise. Of course, you have HP that sells Linux-based hardware out there. You have System 76, Station X, and other smaller companies that go out there and create specialized hardware for business and consumer level products. There are dozens of more companies out there, but I've named the biggest 2. There are Dell and HP that absolutely sell Linux-based systems out there in the public. So that claim does not hold any weight either. The next myth I want to tackle is no such thing as a beginner distro. So you've got the best community in the world, I think, supporting Linux. There are some trolls out there, obviously, but 90% of the community out there are some of the best people you're ever going to meet. They're going to rally around you to help you in IRC chat and forums when you post questions, as long as you're trying your hardest to learn this stuff on your own and you get stuck. They are going to help you and be there for you and support you, and they do it for free, right? It's their own time they're giving for no reason. So in that aspect, Linux has the best community in the world. The no such thing as a beginner distro, I've heard both in good terms and bad terms, meaning there's no such thing as a beginner distro because all distros are difficult, which is just completely false. I think we've already kind of busted that. There's nothing difficult about, launching your programs here, going to find them, or a search bar to find the program you want, or running Steam to play games, whatever. There's nothing hard about that. The other one I've heard is there's no such thing as beginner distro, and kind of a nice thing in that all these distros are easy. And of course, anytime you make a claim like that, it could be difficult because there's always examples like Linux from scratch and things like that, which can be tremendously difficult and obviously would not be beginner friendly to anybody. But for the most part, I would say for your major distributions out there today, most of them have done a fantastic job of making Linux friendly to the users. So there are ones who do it better than others, such as Elementary OS or Linux Mint or Ubuntu. These distros you log into and immediately you feel that familiarness that you would feel if you were booting into something that you used every day, like say Windows. And so from that aspect, they, I think, do a better job. There are other distros just like them that are easy and beautiful when you boot in, that because of the way they've set up their software distribution, or there may be a lot more in the terminal that you're going to have to play with if you want any third-party applications and that type of thing, that may be a little more difficult for you to learn. So I think there are beginner-like distros out there, but it's something that I've heard there's no such thing as beginner distro, and there's some truth to it, but ultimately there are distros that are better for beginners than distros. And by the way, an important note here: just because a distro is great for beginners doesn't mean it's not also fantastic for your super experienced users. It almost reminds me of when I went to go buy a Harley, and I was getting a Nightster. And this was my first time ever riding a motorcycle. And the guys, I said, I don't want to be made fun of by other Harley people because I'm getting a Nightster and I'm not getting a Softail or something like that. And the guy was like, look, you see that dude is 6'6" over there? Looks like he could bench press a car. I'm like, yeah. He goes, he rides a Nightster. You think he gets made fun of? Well, I'm not 6'6". But the point is there, don't let anybody in the community, if you're like, I love Ubuntu and I want to use Ubuntu and I started with Ubuntu or Linux Mint or anything else, tell you what distro to use, or this is for more advanced people, or it's great to learn on, but then you're going to migrate to this. You do you. Don't worry about what other people think about different distros and stuff. It doesn't matter. We all talk about distro hopping and it's fun and all that. If you want to do that, you can. If you're more interested in getting an operating system that's stable and works and is secure, that's your reason to switching to Linux. Don't feel any pressure with the distro that you choose. Choose one, stick with it. Believe me, there are advanced, brilliant minds using the same distro you are, even if some people say, well, that one's more, based around beginners. Installing software is hard. So this is Arch here as an example. So if I start typing in software, I'll get add or remove software, and I get this package manager here. And you can see this shows all the programs that I've installed. Now, in other distributions, you may have something like a GNOME software store or whatnot, but essentially they all generally have some form of a software store. The main distros do, and you won't have to use the terminal or anything to do that. So if I want to install Simple Note, which is a program that I use as a replacement for OneNote, I type in Simple Note here. I find it. You can see I already installed it. I would right-click it, install, and we would be good to go. In fact, I'm going to find something I haven't installed here. Let's do Notepad here, and let's do LeafPad. All I'm going to do here, I check that box. I'm going to click Apply. I'm going to click Commit. I'm going to type in my password, and now that software is going to install. In fact, it's already installed. This is completely installed. There's LeafPad, my simple editor that I just installed. Installing software on Linux is easier, in my opinion, than installing software in Windows. Because if you're going to Windows, number one, you're going to be having to get your wallet out. Number two, you're going to have to be waiting for that registration key to be emailed to you if you bought it digitally. And then number three, you're going to be going through all these prompts and unchecking boxes that say, do you want me to go ahead and install, a toolbar over top, or an Ask Jeeves toolbar, or Chrome, or all this other advertising and all this other crap that you got to deal with. I didn't have to do anything. You've seen how simple and easy that is. Installing software on Linux could not be simpler. It is so much easier than in Windows, which is why we're able to distro hop and move so much. You can't run your favorite software on Linux is a myth that I hear. There are thousands and thousands of alternatives to the software that you use, and for the most case, like OBS and other things, there's a lot of software. Firefox, Chrome, your browsers that you like to use, Sublime Text, whatever it is, there are lots of that software that's available on Linux. If you want to use FileZilla, or you want to use Microsoft Office 365, for instance, you can obviously use that through your browser here. Watch Netflix, watch Amazon. If you want Microsoft Office on your desktop, you may have to install something like Wine for you to install that, but there are plenty of alternatives. So Skype, Dropbox, Firefox, LibreOffice, Google Chrome, Adobe Acrobat Reader, NVIDIA proprietary drivers, OBS, Spotify apps, if you want a music app on your desktop, Twitch apps, all this stuff is available within Linux. Now, there are certain programs that are not available unless you utilize Wine or Crossover, one of those type of tools. And Wine is completely free, and so there is some validity to this claim. For instance, if you want to go install Adobe Premiere in here, you'd probably have to go to Crossover or something to get it to work. Now, in my case, all those programs that I had for decades had built on Windows. I was able to find alternatives going to the website Alternative 2. And you just type in the program and it'll give you an alternative. For instance, for Premiere, I just switched to Kdenlive. It's completely free. I don't have to upgrade the package every single year. I do donate, some money and funds to some of these programs, but I don't have to sit there and pay $70 every single year for them, and I'm constantly getting updates here. So there's some truth to this. Some programs you will not be able to run in Linux, but you're going to find there's far more that you can run than you can't, which is awesome. The myth we busted also goes in our top 10 is you have to use the terminal. The terminal is not scary in the least bit. It reminds me of working on computers a long time ago of the DOS prompt out there. And there are many incredible things you can do with the terminal. You can do the same software install I just did right from the terminal, and it's even quicker than what you saw there. But with that being said, you don't have to ever touch this thing 9 times out of 10. The only time you may have to touch it is if you have some special hardware or something you're trying to get to work, and someone will give you the command that you cut and paste in there and run. Now, you should do some reading, make sure it's a legit forum, make sure those type of things. But for the most part, you're going to stay away from the terminal, and you could just use the GUI interface. You don't have to touch it. Linux can't get viruses. So this one is great for the community, great to go out there and tout to people because, it's a big reason why someone might use Linux, but it's false. Linux can get viruses. It's just much more difficult for Linux, and more so than even as difficult as it is, because obviously the file system, the user file system, is completely separated from the kernel, and because of that, if one thing gets infected, it's not going to necessarily destroy your entire computer. And there's all kinds of things that go into some of the reasons why it's a little more difficult for Linux to get a virus. But the big thing is Linux obviously doesn't have the population that Windows users have. Generally speaking, too, a Linux user just frankly is going to be more experienced in their computer, understand how it works better, and have a better knowledge of the inner workings of their system, and probably less likely to click on stupid links and download things they shouldn't be, etc. So Linux is a smaller market. People who write virus software aren't going to target Linux as heavily because of that from a desktop standpoint. In addition to that, some of the ways the file system and kernel interact with each other are going to make Linux a little less susceptible to viruses than, say, something like Windows. But that's not necessarily true. If you install Linux, don't go thinking you can just do and install and download whatever you want, because you still could get hit, just a little less likely. And the last thing I want to kill, that hopefully I've already killed on my channel, is you can't game on Linux. So there's this thing, I know nobody's ever heard of it, called Steam here. And installing games in Steam is a matter of clicking on the game and then clicking install, and that's it. There's no terminal, there's no doing anything special or running configuration files to get it to work. It's just going to install, and you're going to click play next, and that's it. But gaming on Linux is absolutely amazing, and we can launch Rocket League just to show you how simple it is to play a game here on Linux, and games run fantastic, especially games that do a great job with native support, like Rocket League has done. There are some games that have bad ports over to Linux, just like there are some games that have bad ports from consoles to PC and vice versa. But for the most part, the community is always going to be there to help. So gaming on Linux, let's just go to training. I don't want to go online. Gaming on Linux is fabulous. There are tons of games out there. Now, if you are one of those people that's stuck and has to play a Blizzard game or has to play a specific game, you want to check and make sure it's available on Linux. With that being said, Wine is another tool or crossover that you can use to play some of those, like Battle.net can be downloaded now with a crossover, and you can still play some of those games. But if you don't want to have to do a workaround, you don't have to install another program or configure it, and you want to go on Steam and just make sure that your games are compatible. Most of my games that I already had in my Steam folder when I switched over to Linux were available already within Linux. When I switched from Windows, that is, to Linux, they were already there and available. So it games fantastic. You're going to get great results from that. There are tons of games to play, and I could show you my Steam folder here. So, 12 is better than 6, Amnesia, Arma, Baldur's Gate, BioShock, Borderlands, of course, Darkest Dungeon, Dead Age, Dust. I mean, I'm not reading them all here, but Faster Than Light, of course, all your Half-Lives, Hero Siege, Killing Floor, Left 4 Dead. We've got Splatter, Blood Red, Super Meat Boy, Sundered, Tomb Raider, Tyranny. Of course, what's the big one? Witcher is on here as well, XCOM 2, Undertales, all of these games available. So can you game on Linux? Heck yeah, you can game on Linux. You can game really well on Linux. There's lots of games out there available for Linux that you can play. If you're stuck on a particular game, you can always dual boot. That's the amazing thing about Linux too. You could dual boot into your Windows just to play your games if you want to, and go right back into Linux to be safe, secure, and just feel a lot more geeky and grow your brain a heck of a lot more in Linux than you ever will in Windows. So that's it. Those are the 10 myths that we've busted in record time about Linux. Leave your comments below. Let me know if I misstated anything. I know you will. And until next time, get out there and fill your brains.
Don't forget us.